Well, welcome. My name is Emmanuel Pastreich, and I am the director of Center for Truth Politics at Green Liberty. And I'm here today with Jeremy Kuzmarov of Covert Action to talk a little bit about what we can expect from Trump 2.0, and specifically the central figures at the beginning who don't always appear in the newspaper and whose relationship is not always entirely clear. I'm thinking about what I would characterize as the Gang of Five, and the specific characters are Donald Trump, who you've probably heard of, uh, Marco Rubio, Miriam Adelson, Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel, and how they come together and what exactly they have in mind for us. So let's start maybe, if you don't mind, Jeremy, just with Donald Trump. Uh, how do you see Donald Trump 2.0? How is he? Obviously, there are similarities, but how is he different in what he's trying to do or how he's being used?
Well, he may feel more emboldened. He's got a huge majority now. He's got control. The Republicans have the control of the Congress. And it was a fairly resounding election victory. The Democratic Party really is in disarray. So I think he feels emboldened to go forward with his own agenda. And, essentially is a right wing, extreme right wing agenda
Right,
involving, tax cuts. For the wealthy and for corporations, deregulation, cutting of government programs. As far as foreign policy, he's kind of all over the map, but I mean, I think there's a very strong anti-China, anti-Iran agenda. So I think we may see flashpoints more in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. I think will continue supporting this project of the Greater Israel, which we
mm,
see playing out now with the fall of the Assad dynasty, has emboldened the Israelis to move into Syria. And that's really key in their long-term project, which is really a U.S.-Israeli project of regime change Iran and establishing Israel as a forward base for U.S. power and as a
right.
regional hegemon.
Right, right. Uh, and how do you think when we look at? I mean, you did mention the Supreme Court, of course, which is also a large part of this. He has a total domination of the court in a way that he didn't previously, which allows him basically carte blanche now with essentially uh, the president being in power to do whatever he wants, so not impeachable.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, there are other aspects of the right-wing agenda, and I think they use the immigration issue, to diffuse any class conflict. They turn
Right.
people against immigrants. That's a kind of classic strategy. And I mean, they're going to move full forward with draconian anti-immigrant and deportation policies, and they'll
Mm.
try and advance, other right-wing goals. Some in the realm of the cultural war, like with abortion
Right,
issue. So yeah, I mean, I think the rise of Trump and dominance of the GOP is a product of the failure of the Democratic Party and left. The left got so enthralled with identity politics and just kind of followed the lead of the Democratic Party, which became more and more corporatized
right,
and did not organize independently. And did not organize along class line and kind of lost working class America along the way.
right,
Uh, and, so now they've got to rebuild, an independent left-wing movement to push back against the right-wing agenda. And it should be noted that a lot of the Democratic congressmen are going along are pretty far to the right themselves and support a lot of aspects of Trump's agenda, including even this government efficiency program, that this group with Musk
Dodge,
that's
right,
tasked with cutting government programs. I think you have a lot of support from Democrats for that. And certainly in foreign policy, the Democrats seem to have outflanked the Republicans on the right as the most hawkish party, and we've discussed that before.
right,
And you have all these intelligence operatives who are in the Democrats now,
right,
and they're going to go along with Trump's, agenda, whether in the Middle East, Southeast Asia. I mean, Ukraine, I don't know that will really. I think that's just going to drag on as a quagmire. I think that was the goal of the foreign policy elite, was just to bog the Russians down, like with Afghanistan in the
right,
80s. And look, Syria is a big coup for the neoconservative agenda, and Russia was preoccupied with Ukraine. They didn't have their attention on Syria, and that occurred. Assad fell, and now Russia has lost a lot of ground in the Middle East. So
right.
I think both, the Democrats certainly are the most anti-Russia hawks, but I don't know that Trump will change U.S. policy very much vis-a-vis Ukraine either.
Right. Well, it is remarkable to me the number of Democrats who are screaming about Trump being a fascist and a Hitler and the end of democracy. And then as soon as the election was over, they were there lining up to kiss his ring, basically, to get their bit of budget. He it seems to have been basically a show for us that worry about losing democracy.
Absolutely, yeah, and I don't know what this. I mean, Antifa seems to reflect the weakness of the left, and I don't know if that seems to be just some kind of cutout organization funded
Hmm.
by big money or the CIA or an adjunct of the Democratic Party. It's not a real opposition movement,
Right, right,
and they seem to just stir up conflict, which is, I think, what the ruling elites want.
right.
They favor a divide and rule strategy. They want to pit people against each other uh, on partisan levels, and foment unrest and violence even in the streets, so people won't come together against this
Right,
plutocracy that's carrying out these criminal policies, as we've
right,
discussed many times, and criminal foreign policies.
right,
Uh, Waging wars around the world that are killing millions of people.
right,
And I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal after the Syria, fall of Assad, and they were like, "Oh, this is great. Iran is weakened, and Israel is in the process of decapitating Hamas and Hezbollah, and Iran has lost out." I mean, I guess if you look at it in this term, but what about the human lives?
right,
There have been millions of deaths, and Amnesty International had a report, sanctioning what we all know, that this is a genocide carried out in Gaza. Uh, and then you look at Ukraine and the number of deaths that have resulted from that conflict that was totally avoidable. You had the
right,
Minsk
right,
peace agreement that we know, and that the U.S. helped ensure that it was blocked. So I mean, there at least, I don't know, the number of deaths would be in the hundreds of thousands,
right,
and
right.
many communities have been destroyed. A totally avoidable conflict. So I mean, I don't know what kind of calculation do people have that they have no care for human life. Those lives just don't matter at all. And on that, now Israel has a strong, stronger position, which is debatable, because
Oh,
they've
it's
invited so many enemies that
right,
they're
right.
very
I,
vulnerable to attack.
I think Syria, it would be, I think it's too early to call Syria as being a great victory for Israel. I mean, the United States and Israel having troops in Syria long term could be catastrophic. I'm not sure that I mean, at the moment, just like in Iraq, it looks good. You get some good, mission accomplished footage, but it may not play out the way people are anticipating.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's a totally unstable country, and I mean the
Right.
head of state was a wanted
Tragically.
terrorist for Al Qaeda, and these faction may just the country may become enmeshed in endless
Mhm.
warfare, and I mean the living standard of the people has just been horrendous, and the sanction, I mean, that was a cruel policy in the face of years
Mhm.
of warfare, to apply these draconian sanctions based on a fraudulent pretext
Yeah.
deliberately designed to starve the population, to weaken the regime. I mean, it's just a strategy out of the Middle Ages or out of the Nazi siege of Leningrad.
Right,
It's like they want to maximize human suffering and death.
right,
Uh,
right,
so
right,
it's just I can't think of greater cruelty. And
right,
yeah, it's an ambiguous outcome. It may
right.
totally backfire
Mm.
for their pet, the Israelis in the Middle East. And a lot of I know a lot of Israelis have had to flee Israel. They can't live there anymore. It's
Right.
incredibly dangerous, volatile climate. It's a growing authority. They don't want to live in an
Oppressive, oppressive.
authoritarian, oppressive
Right,
state.
right,
And there are a
yeah,
lot of Israelis coming to North America now to
right,
escape. So how good is that for Israelis?
right.
Uh, and the level of killing and the corruption of the country, the level of mental illness and suicide. I'm reading a report among
Mm.
Israeli soldiers who served in the IDF is very high.
Right,
And we know those kind of wars just destroy the moral fabric of society and
right, right,
destroy human lives. Even and these are soldiers who many may be implicated in serious war crimes,
right,
but they're destroyed as humans as well. A lot of
right,
human, we
right,
do have some empathy and compassion, most of
right,
us in us, and
right,
human feeling. And when we've been conditioned to kill and done some horrible things, this came
right.
out of the Vietnam War here. A lot of those young men were wrecked, who
Well,
went
I
to
think
Vietnam.
it's affected American politics as well. I mean, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragging on over 2 decades, it really did affect the political culture in the United States, and it sort of uh, made people more cynical, made hypocrisy and criminality more sort of acceptable. It
Yeah.
became sort of part of our culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, there's a blowback effect, all the mass
mm,
shootings that we've seen
that too.
in our
That's
country
too.
and this kind of darkness. I mean, you turn on
Right.
the TV and it's all about murder. There are these dark shows about serial killers, and
Right.
it's
No.
so,
Well, a
and
lot of
look, a lot
people,
of,
they came back from being veterans in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then they started working for private prisons. They started working for Homeland Security. They started organizing their own little, uh, false flag operations, just like they were doing in Afghanistan. I mean, it's sort of come in the same way the Phoenix program came back to the U.S.
yeah.
And gave us a lot of the nightmares. A lot of stuff that was being done in Afghanistan has come back to roost as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a great book that looks at that historically by Alfred McCoy called Policing America's Empire. And he
Hmm.
looks at the colonial Philippines and how these central figures who developed this repressive surveillance apparatus in the Philippines and
Hmm.
counterinsurgency operations came back to run police agencies and
Right,
worked like with the FBI to develop systematic surveillance of
right,
left-wing groups and dissidents in the United States.
right, right,
And
right,
that totally compromised U.S. democracy and corrupted our society from that
right,
time. And it's grown worse,
right,
as you
right,
point out. And then there are those who realize what they did was wrong, and then they're just mentally anguished.
right,
Those who have more of a conscience and are not totally corrupted and dehumanized from their military activity, who try and come out of it, but they're tortured souls because they've been
right,
involved in such horrific things.
right, right,
And this
right,
goes back generation with the Korean and Vietnam War. That's one reason they had to abolish the draft.
right,
They try and distance the public by using drones and high
right, right,
technology and
right,
proxy forces, but you can't escape the violence and horror, and it comes back in different dark ways to our own society. So
right, right.
we need to build a genuine anti-imperialist movement. And I
Mm.
was reading a good article the other day, and it was pointing out that empire, I mean, yes, the violence is central to it and the wars, but there's also an economic dimension, economic imperialism that people ought to be more attuned to, how the U.S. and Western country, plunder third world countries, and create these huge disparities around the world And that's a key feature of it too, that people are oblivious to. And then they go crazy when people immigrate to the United States or other Western countries. When we've destabilized those countries, and we've also skewed
Right,
the global economy against them. So it's naturally some will try and come here, and then we're all outraged that they
right,
come here.
right,
So there's this level of ignorance in our society, and that's why I think education is so vital. But
right,
that's why the power elite has targeted higher education, as you and I know, by
right,
purging critical faculty. And that's, I think, on gone overdrive. There's always been problems in higher education like that, that genuinely critical voices or leftists or truth tellers
right,
have problems there, but it's gotten worse in the last 15 years, I would say.
right. Well,
And
let let me ask you about the second figure I had mentioned. That is Marco Rubio, a rival of Donald Trump's, in some ways, someone more capable of staying focused, actually doing day-to-day administrative tasks, which Donald Trump is too indulgent or too short-tempered or too um, flitty to manage. And so this sort of marriage of Trump and Rubio running the White House, uh, what does that promise? What sort of chemistry is there between them? What sort of rivalry? What will the impact of Rubio be on this administration?
well, Rubio is tied with the anti-Cuba lobby in Florida, and that milieu of these extreme right-wing Cubans who fled, Castro. Many of them were from families who were in the upper class who had been
Right,
allied with the Batista dictatorship, and they have an obsessive right-wing anti-Castro viewpoint. They're not rational people. If you talk to those kind of people, you can't have regular discourse. You
right,
find that in the Vietnamese community too. Some may have had bad experience, or some member of their family had something bad, or if they were large landowners or business owners, they lost the business, or I mean, there were losers with the Castro Revolution. It was mostly among the elite. So
hmm
they have this visceral hatred for Castro and what they call communism, similar to some Vietnamese who are,
right,
in a way they're traitors to their own country, but they're not rational thinker. They're obsessive anti-communists, and it leads to these extremist support for extremist policies, and they have this unhealthy or naive view of the United States as a savior. I mean, it's basically a blatantly colonialist outlook that the
right,
United
right,
States is their savior and get rid of this tyrant and free their country or something. So they, support these regime change operations, and even would support probably some, more overt military intervention, whether in Cuba, whether in Venezuela, any
hmm
left-leaning government that's trying to forge an independent path and adopt more socialistic policies.
hmm
They'll favor regime change and heavy-handed U.S. intervention. So Rubio, their champion, I think he embraces that worldview. Paradoxically, he claims to be against autocracy, but he's close with the El Salvador leader, and this hasn't gotten that much attention, but this guy in El Salvador has some horrible things going on. Nayib Bukele is the leader of El Salvador, and he's basically very similar to Rodrigo Duterte in Philippines, where
right,
he's declare the war on gangs and just like unhinge the police. There's no restraints on what the police can do,
right,
and supported mass sweeps of anybody with any affiliation. Usually, it just means police going into a poor neighborhood and arresting all the young men and throwing them in jail
right,
for decades. And the prisons there are horribly overcrowded. And there are
right,
many innocent people who've been caught up in these sweeps, and he doesn't care. He's like, oh, well, the bigger picture is, it's safe to walk the streets now, so I don't care if there's no due process and if a few innocent people got caught up in this. And meanwhile, Amnesty International, I read, did a report on the prisons. It's horrific jail condition because of so much overcrowding. They've arrested so many people. They don't have enough food or accommodation for all these people. So this is like, it's just totally inhumane. It's like you had that. I studied the Phoenix program in Vietnam.
Right,
That's what happened. They were arresting too many people. And then the USAID was provisioning money for expanding the prisons, and it got stolen by corrupt officers. So you'd have people, there wasn't even a place for them. They had to sleep standing up. And they had
right,
to I reviewed the records, the National Archives. These were actually reports by American public safety officers. And this is kind of thing happening in El Salvador. There's not enough food, not enough place for them to sleep. Diseases are rampant.
right,
It's horrific. And this guy has concentrated more and more power among himself. So he's a true dictator. And a few American congressmen have tried to alert people of what's going on, notably Jim McGovern. So anyway, Rubio is a total hypocrite because he claims to be against autocracy
right,
in the case of like Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba, but so is so close to this brutal leader in El Salvador. And yeah, if you look around the world, he is really a neoconservative. So it fits with the path. He's very hawkish on Iran, very anti-China. He supported a lot of strong anti-China legislation. Ramping up the trade war, supporting the
right, right,
pivot to Asia. Supporting this kind of neo-McCarthyism in the United States. So it fits the pattern where Trump on the campaign trail kind of throws some bones, to electorate that wants more peace-oriented foreign policy and much less hawkish. And so Trump makes like he's their friend and that he's an isolationist or he's going to end the wars. But then he goes and appoints these neoconservative types. And you had that in the first term with Mike Pompeo and John
right, right,
Bolton running his foreign policy. So it's really still these neocons in charge. And I think we'll see particular focus on Latin America, more aggressive regime change operations with a Rubio in there because he was close with Juan Guaido and these elements who were trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government and
right,
involved numerous coup plots. And they were extremely corrupt. They stole Guaido had no credentials, had no support within Venezuela, but was anointed as the leader here in the United States by people like Rubio. And then
right,
his
right.
circle were totally corrupt. They stole all the money. So,
But I mean, it might be with Rubio. I mean, right now, between the buildup against China and then the war with Iran, uh, the South America might not be at the on the the main dish at the table, but you still think that South America, Central America would be very critical for him because of his background, his supporters.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so
And
interesting. Well,
quietly, I mean, quietly, they've been going out these policies for decades, so they're going to
mhm,
continue, but they may ramp it up. And it may go
right,
under, as you say, the radar of the public. They'll be focused on the crisis in the Middle East, will get all the attention, but they're going to
right.
slowly tighten the screws in South America, and maybe they'll make a big deal of it. I mean, they could also, they have a lot of tools at their disposal. They can stage, false flag incidents or something dramatic to get the public's attention on it, and then they can carry out something more expansive than what's already going
Understood.
on.
Understood. Well, let me go to the third figure, the person who did a lot to support Donald Trump and Marco Rubio in some ways, who brought them together and made the sort of the core of this new administration. And that's a woman, Miriam Adelson, widow of Sheldon Adelson, and who has gave, I guess, $100 million each or more in the campaign, and of course much more before as Rubio was running and Trump as well. So what is her agenda and how does she play into the formation of this new administration?
Well, yeah, these are these billionaires who have shaped U.S. policy for a long time now, both parties. and these have been major donors. Yeah, Sheldon Adelson was a mafia-linked casino mogul in Las Vegas. So, you
Hmm.
see the billionaires are utterly devoid of ethics, and you see basically through families like that the penetration of organized crime into the American government and the values of organized crime, and they try and legitimize themselves through philanthropies.
Right.
Uh, but really, Adelson is a gangster, and he represents the extreme right wing in Israel. He's very close with Netanyahu and the Likud party, which has its roots in the Herut party, which was a terrorist organization in the 1940s and 50s, the
Hmm.
1940s especially, and they assassinated even British officials, and they were modeled after European fascist
Right.
groups. So, this is just more or less a fascist who, has no morality and organized
But she has a
crime.
very clear agenda, though, in terms of
Yeah, to promote the
war with
greater
Iran
Israel.
and
Yeah, I mean, this is the project of the Greater Israel, again, that the Wall Street Journal is celebrating, that right now has involved the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and moral degradation of Israeli society. And they're
mhm.
kind of cheerleading on a war with Iran that would cause many, many more deaths.
Right.
So, human life has no value for people who have that mentality, and they just want to expand Israel. I mean, Israel's moving with tanks into Syria, and they already illegally annexed the Golan Heights, and
Right.
now they're going for more territory in Syria. That's why they wanted to weaken Syria. I mean, I think that was the goal. Assad was a strong figure who kind of kept the country together. And so by removing him, and now that the country may become balkanized, it may not even have
Right.
a functioning central government, and that makes it easier prey for them to expand their territory,
Right.
consolidate what they already have, and then to use Syria as a platform or base for attacking Iran and to cut off, Iranian support for Hezbollah through Syria and through Syrian intermediaries. So it fits the designs of those who support, which the project for Greater Israel can be compared with the project for New American Century.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right.
these are, arch imperialists who just want to expand um, their power and influence and have no regard for human life. So, and then they
Right.
want to trigger endless wars. And they're happy because they're supported by, big oil and elements that profit off wars are very happy with these
Mhm.
projects because it guarantees them continued billions
Right.
through profiting from war.
Right. Well, it's one of the ironies of our whole uh, economic system, in which growth and consumption are considered to be the highest values. Right. That war is one of the greatest ways to create consumption and demand, of course, but at a tremendous human cost. However, when we calculate our economic growth, human cost is not really figured into growth.
Yeah, exactly. And they just want to dominate, they want their country to be dominant and crush everybody else. And it
Right.
doesn't matter if they're the genocide. I mean, that's been the mentality historically of a lot of, whether Genghis Khan or empire, builders or, North
Mhm.
America, they had no concern at all for the Native Americans who
Right.
were
Right.
brutally treated. So, I mean, the mentality is very similar in Israel toward the Palestinians, the natives, that of the settlers here toward the Native Americans.
Right.
Unfortunately, that mentality seems to prevail often throughout history. And I don't know, it's not a good reflection of our species. It's more like a caveman who just
Right.
wants
Right.
more and more for himself and is willing to kill and destroy others and has no compassion for murder of children and starving
Right.
people, displaced people. And that's sad, but that's the reality of human
Well,
species.
let me mention the fourth person who's playing this key role in the beginning of the formation of the Trump 2.0. and that is Elon Musk, the who's now going to be heading this uh, Dodge Department of Government Efficiency. Can't wait to privatize the entire government, remove all expertise, and essentially put everything online and have corporations get a chunk out of everything. What is your sense of what what his role is in the formation of this Trump regime, and what's he trying to achieve? What how does this affect the equation?
Well, he seems to be very significant, and there was a New York Times article, I think yesterday, called "Tycoons of Silicon Valley Steer Transition for Trump's Team." So, I mean, I think we see the complete takeover of the government by corporate interest, corporate power, big
Right,
tech, very connected with the CIA and intelligence agencies.
right,
Uh, and yeah, I mean, I think this wants to eviscerate the social democratic state and the order that was set up under the New Deal that's kind of been teetering on the brink of collapse for the last 10 or 30
right,
years.
right,
And this
right,
is just dealing the hammer blow to that. And that concept of government, of a safety net, a regulation of big business, of a balance between the public and private sector. But
right,
now we just have the complete takeover of the private sector, and they're gutting in the name of more efficiency. And I mean, it's true that there is some, unwieldy bureaucracy, and there is some need for cost cutting in certain areas,
mhm,
but they're using that to advance this extreme right-wing agenda of
right,
privatizing services, gutting core
right,
services, and doing basically dismantling the welfare state, any pretense of social democracy. And that favor the interests, yeah, of these corporations that will, profit
right,
more and more. And it'll create a society ever more of haves and have-nots.
right,
Uh,
right.
then again, it's this lack of compassion. The elite classes look down on the
Right.
masses, and they kind of want to keep them down.
Well, I think it's also important to note in the case of Elon Musk that he's, in a sense, preparing for this global war against all of humanity. On the one hand, with Skylink, we have this enormous thousands and thousands of low orbit uh, uh, satellites, many of which are able to track and even to attack people and part of all sorts of other advanced weapon systems. On the other hand, he also has this boring company which digs holes underground all over the world. Many of these are classified. We don't even know how many of these tunnels exist and what's going through them all across under the United States, under your feet right now. He's been with his open AI, all sorts of very sophisticated mass manipulations, psychological information, misinformation, manipulation, control, and also efforts through various interfaces to affect the emotions, the thinking of individuals by all sorts of links between the brain and various computer systems.
Yeah, that's very disturbing. Yeah, they seem to be trying to alter human psychology and in a way, and human being, and destroy any capacity for independent critical thinking. Yeah, putting everything online, it kind of isolates people from each
Right,
other. And we saw that in the COVID pandemic. These are kind of people pushing the lockdown, this false narrative about COVID. And that was
right,
a way to keep people more isolated. And, I read a good book by Kees Vanderpil that discussed how prior to the lockdown and the COVID, there were a lot of there was an upsurge in protest movements in Europe
right,
and North
right.
America, and
Especially
people were
the
developing
yellow jackets.
yeah, more solidarity. And then with COVID, they were all isolated
Right,
and put online, and kids were just even. I mean, they've changed the way education. Everything is done online, and it's just like kids don't have the same social interactions as we did
right,
as
right,
kids, and that seems to be by design. They want to keep people more isolated, and they want to, yeah, be able to manipulate them through different computer systems. So th this is very disturbing, yeah.
Right, right,
And
right.
it's moving toward this techno-fascism, and
Well, it's
yeah, there.
amazing. I mean, Elon Musk, I mean, he's given legitimacy to Trump to some degree because people perceive him as being this quote unquote libertarian who's like standing up against, for standing up for free speech, even though he essentially became a billionaire on Department of Defense budgets and, I mean, DARPA uh, funded projects about government, local government, state government, and federal government, essentially giving him billions and billions of dollars to support his electric car business and other investments. So it's hard to imagine how you could possibly see him as this libertarian, anti-government, free speech hero.
Well, we covered this. I teach American history course in community college, and we look at the it's post-Civil War history, and we look at the Gilded Age, and
Right,
I point out the hypocrisy of the robber barons that they preach this rhetoric of laissez-faire and this kind of libertarian economic philosophy, and yet the majority grew rich off the government. And
right,
there's this
right,
book by Richard White called Railroad about the railroad barons and how they relied on government subsidies, and of course the military pacifying the Native American and moving them off the land so they could build the railroad. That's a form of government intervention. And then
for
a lot
sure.
of them mismanaged, as he shows in the book, they mismanaged their business and they used their connection to secure big government bailouts. And he just, in that particular book, goes into a number of ways the government, they were totally dependent on the government for their fortune and
Right,
business success. And so it seems to be a direct parallel with what you're describing with
with
Elon Musk. And it
right.
just puts the hypocrisy when they preach this anti-government philosophy, and yet they benefit from the government. And really, they want the government to work for them and
Right.
not for the
Not for
majority.
you. Right. Well, I mentioned the last figure along the lines in that multi-billionaire class here after Miriam Adelson, Elon Musk, and that's Peter Thiel, who is also playing a major role here and has, of course, in the past, I mean, with advancing Vance to be the vice president, I mean, basically with Rubio, Vance, and Trump playing a major role. How do you see his? I mean, similar to Musk, but there are some differences. How do you see him and his role?
Well, I do know of his connection to Palantir, that he was a founder of Palantir, which is really at the
Hmm.
cutting edge as far as AI and surveillance. And
Hmm.
it's a key war profiteer in both Ukraine and Israel, providing battlefield intelligence and the technology, satellite imagery used for bombing operations. So I know his connection to that company and the military industrial complex. And I know he was and the mass surveillance. I know he's funded JD Vance's career.
Central positions at the beginning of the forming the administration. In my childhood, or I never saw anything like this before in administration. That obviously there were politicians who had to pay tribute and get support from big business. This is clear, but that these two major figures, basically from DARPA, from the military, IT conglomerates would be playing the central role is really something that it was hard to imagine previously.
Yeah, and there was this article in the New York Times that was saying how all these tech executives are being invited to play a role, and they were debating, oh, should they work part-time in the government because they didn't want to give up their
Oh, they're
lucrative
right.
business holdings, and
Right,
they want to continue making their billions. So do they like, a lot of them probably don't really want to do the daily hard work of running a government. They
right,
like the access to power, to be able to influence certain policies, but they're committed to their businesses. So,
Right,
but yeah, I see you. I mean, it's just a complete merger of corporations and the state, and that they're even inviting now these, tech executives and CEO to serve in the government. And we've never really seen that, in top positions. Although, I
right.
mean, there is a phenomenon of the revolving door where a lot of time they do move in and out. Uh, of these huge corporations. I mean, certainly you see that with the Pentagon figures who go to work for
Oh, for sure.
large arms companies, and vice versa. Um, but on the other hand, yeah, I haven't seen this kind of thing where all these CEOs and billionaires are being invited to serve in the government and important positions and to run
Right.
things. So, yeah, it,
Oh,
it does seem to be the next phase, and I mean that is fascism is defined as a merger of corporation and the state. And
right.
so, I mean, it is a kind of fascism. I mean, I don't think we'll see the kind of direct repression that you saw like in Nazi Germany or Mussolini Italy, because the left is not strong to challenge this. There are no really,
They don't have
strong
to be suppressed.
movements. And I mean, they've
Right,
co-opted the union movement
right, right,
so that
right,
the union leaders are not really a threat. They try and work with the government, maybe to bargain a bit for their own interest, but they don't really challenge government policy
right,
fundamentally or threaten, major strikes that could cripple the economy. And a lot of time they align with U.S. empire. And there's a book I reviewed about AFL-CIO and how, starting in the 40s when they purged all the leftists and more militant elements in the McCarthy era, and they
right,
then just align with U.S. empire abroad. And we've seen that with a lot of the major union leaders. So they're not really a threat. So they're not. There's no need to repress them as in a classic European fascism. But there are, fascistic qualities of the
right,
evolution of
right, right.
U.S. state. Yeah.
Well, I think that certainly that lack of other sort of major political players out there in terms of organizations uh, is is a major factor. That there isn't what we had, and I mean, unions were corrupt. They were imperfect in many ways, as humans are. But in the 1950s, 1960s through 1970s, even into the 80s, there was still this sort of unit out there of some element of the political discourse, which was not just paid for by Wall Street or by major banks. Whereas now, I mean, it was starting with, I mean, Clinton was the great transformer of that with this decision of the Democratic Party not to try and appeal to working people even superficially, but to just try and service those parts of the multinational corporations which were not being serviced enough by the Republicans, right? So he was able to find that sort of niche, and that sort of fundamentally transformed uh, the sort of the whole political discourse. There's a cartoon I saw once, um, I guess back in 2000 something, and it has the Republican and the Democrat at the bar after the election, and the Democrat says to the Republican, "I'm sure glad the election's over now, so we don't have to pretend that we care about working people." And
Mhm.
the Republican replies, "The who?" So
Yeah,
that was the sort
that's
of
a
the
good one.
difference between the two, right? They sort of
Yeah, the cartoonists have a good knack for summing things up very simply and eloquently, and
so.
with adding a mix of humor.
But that I've seen that so many times, right? That the Democrats that there's sort of wring their hands with a sort of false sort of hypocrisy, false consciousness, and that's the show. Whereas the Republicans are just they don't even waste their time thinking about the the sort of the cruelty of it all, but they're able to give people a certain sort of excitement in a sense, sort of like playing a video game or you know that gets people riled up. They feel like they're part of something.
Yeah, they do a very good job. They use the cultural issues very well, and the Democrats basically have handed that on the platter by
Right.
this fixation with identity politics and like the transgender issue, and that's obviously going to alienate a lot of middle America. Like where I live in Oklahoma, Markwayne Mullin, the Republican senator, who has among the most regressive policies, and the guy is just an idiot. I mean, he has no education. And he was claiming we have to stop communism. I wrote an op-ed. It was only they wouldn't publish it in the main newspaper, but they did in an alternative. Uh, because he said we have to stop communism in Russia. That's
Communism.
like, wait a
Where's
sec,
communism in
communism fell in
Russia?
1991. I don't think he knows that. This guy is so poorly educated and
Right,
is just
right,
a dumb jock. But he added his ads. It was like I have this. It was like his family, and this is my daughter, and she played in the high school
right.
volleyball. He
Understand?
doesn't want to play with a man, and the Democrats want to put men in women's sports, and we have to stop that. And that was
Right,
his
right,
and that's a winning ad. I mean, a
right.
lot
I
of
understand.
middle Americans like that they're off put by this. Like the Democrats take some of these issues too far. I mean, they fixate that as a substitute for developing a platform to help the working class, and then they
Right,
actually alienate people by pushing something like gender surgeries that
right,
some is child abuse,
right,
and that's gone too far.
right,
So who's supporting that? A tiny, it's like disgusting what they're actually supporting. So
right.
what
I
kind of
agree.
party is that? I mean, if they're trying to win elections by supporting surgeries for a 14-year-old who might have some confusion that this
Right.
surgery it is a form of child. I would agree, it's
I
child
agree.
abuse.
I agree. No, I
And
mean,
then like pushing this sex changes, people will be uncomfortable with a man competing in women's sports. So it's just giving them the election. They can seize on these cultural issues. They don't
right,
even have to discuss economy. There was nothing
right.
in that
I think
election
that's
on
just
economy. We didn't discuss it.
to some degree.
And-
I think that's sort of set up that's sort
yeah,
of intentionally used these divisive issues. I mean, the whole gender thing. I mean, we can talk about that another time and how that was. Uh, um, I mean, it's been manipulated, put it that way. But the
yeah,
communist, I want to say something about communism because that's a really important term, socialism and communism. And there's a very large number of well-meaning Americans who use the terms communism and socialism to refer to totalitarianism and fascism. So they see fascistic practices and they say, oh, well, that's communism. And there's this sort of intentional misnaming or saying, that Biden is a communist, a
yeah,
socialist, or that that these neoliberal, neo-fascist, democratic representatives of multinational banks that they're communists. This is an intentional confusion among many Americans, which has done enormous damage.
absolutely. And I think that's a product of miseducation. And that's why when I teach American history, of
Mhm.
course, I teach one or two a semester at a community college, and the students, yeah, are not well informed, but they're at least open-minded. And that's,
Right,
I try and hammer that because we look at the history of the American Socialist Party. And in fact, I have an exercise where we compare their platform with the Democratic Party platform. And I say, what's the difference? And is it fair to call a Democrat a socialist? So, I think that's a product of McCarthyism. It just
right,
and
right,
it wiped out that history that there is an American Socialist Party.
right.
That this was a legitimate debate about how to run the economy, and it pigeonholed that as something evil, and you don't even discuss it, and you don't even try and analyze or understand it. And I think it's very important that people understand it, and it should be
Well,
part of the debate.
no, well, it's,
But
it's very
not.
interesting. Actually, a lot of places in the United States, there's sort of what we call flyover territory, which is now entirely controlled by the far right Republicans. That in the early 20th century, produced many socialists. They
Yeah,
were socialists elected at local in local government and state government.
Exactly.
And that's all been sort of, and of course, before that, with the Grange, with the Fusionists in Wilmington, there was a whole range of efforts made in farming communities to create cooperative efforts, what you might generally consider to be in the socialist model in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I teach some of that history and try and bring it even in a survey course. And yeah, I mean, it was strongly rooted in red state in the Midwest and the South.
Mm, mm,
And Huey Long, I was doing an article on
right,
his assassination, and he came from a socialist family, and he was promoting a share of the wealth program during the Depression. That was
right,
a form of socialism. Yeah, it's just a history that's been erased.
right,
And I show like they had contests in Texas in the 19 teens for school children, define socialism. And that would be like write an essay about how socialism could be instituted effectively. That was like a
right,
contest for students, and they would offer different analysis. And I show that to students because, and I show also what they said because they don't understand. And I say, look, and then, and then go into Biden's career and how he's the opposite of what a socialist would advocate. He favored the banks,
right,
uh,
right,
and he's an arch capitalist. Uh, I mean, I think I try in my course, but I know they've wiped that out of all curriculum. Like they are introducing more about race now and the racism, although there've been the backlash with the critical race, some tried to abolish the teaching of critical race theory, or they're trying to introduce, like where I live in Tulsa, into the curriculum about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but nothing on socialism. That's just like written out of the history books, and what youth are taught. So it breeds this ignorance in society, and our discourse is so skewed. And they've done this, yeah. It actually goes back to Roosevelt, though. This collection called the Liberty League, a very wealthy interest led by J.P. Morgan, who attacked. They tried to mount a coup against Roosevelt and the
right,
New Deal, and they attacked him as a socialist, which he was not. I mean, he was a Keynesian. In fact, he said he was out to save capitalism by
right,
instituting the New Deal.
right,
So it started then, and now they label every Democratic politician as the party moves further and further to the right and is
mm,
more corporatist. Become stronger in attacking them as socialists or communists. So yeah, it's just this miseducation, and that's why
right,
they've taken control over the education system. And even there, they've pushed this identity politics at the expense of understanding the history of class struggle in America, and efforts at class solidarity and working class movements and left-wing movements. That
right,
history is eviscerated, as well as the history of U.S. imperialism. They don't want that to be taught, or certainly not the
right,
history of the Central Intelligence Agency and
right,
the way that elites used the CIA and covert operations to advance their power and to basically, brainwash the American public.
right,
That
right,
the courts don't want students to learn about.
for
Even
sure,
though that goes back historically, like I covered the Wilson administration set up a propaganda agency in World War One. That was a key turning point as
right,
far as government disinformation and propaganda, to sell wars. But that kind of history, yeah, they don't like you teaching. So
for sure. Well, I guess I'd like to say in closing how stress how important it is to have people who are actually teachers in the political process. That now basically politics is about how much money you can raise from billionaires, right? That's how you start. But that intellectuals, I mean, not everybody, working people can be have expertise in all these fields, whether technology, international relations, history, economics. But to have intellectuals who are interested in actually teaching people, helping them to understand how the world works, and to think for themselves, and to understand things in context, in historical context, because historical awareness is absolutely critical for any real political change. If you don't understand where we came from, where we are now, what we're becoming, then you're so easily swayed by these demagogues and plutocrats.
Absolutely. And actually, one thing that the Socialist Party did very effectively was they developed their own newspaper. They presented good analysis
Hmm.
based on a class view, and they disseminated the newspaper to wide areas.
I
And they reached, farmers and, so I think that's what the left has to do today. They
I
have to
agree.
find
I
big
agree.
outreach. I mean, we do have some good platform as far as developing pretty good critical analysis. But it's kind of buried on the internet, and you have to know where to look. So we need to develop a way to reach Middle America, reach people in rural Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. These
I
people are more open-minded than you'd think. A lot
Oh,
of
for
them are very
sure. For sure.
critical about the way things run, and if they could be better educated, they would turn away from the Trump and move toward a more progressive movement that would help them because a lot of people are struggling.
For sure. Well, I certainly see that potential all the time. I mean, I speak, I mean, just from taking a position against the whole COVID narrative, I met all these conservatives as a result of that. I didn't seek them out, but we had common ground. And I discovered many of them, if you actually could engage them, were certainly capable of thinking more broadly. It's just that they were, I mean, the whole media system is skewed. I mean, I think there's basically this sort of like trap where you buy into one or the other, sort of conservative, in which everything is an issue of person values and individual integrity, or sort of the liberal, which would be everything is a matter of systems and good government. Uh, and of course, both are true. It's a false sort of dichotomy, and then you have to buy into these things. So if you buy into the COVID is dishonest or wrong, then you have to buy into, like, the world is flat, everything's run by the devil, that the environment is a crisis, is a fraud, that viruses don't exist. I mean, all these, there's a whole list of these things you have to buy into as part of that. And on the liberal side also, if you buy into some of the sort of assumptions, then you have to buy into this idea of like this sort of racial ideology, ideas about gender, about identity politics. It's sort of like it comes as a package you have to buy into in American politics.
Yeah, and it becomes so compartmentalized, and you're supposed to be one or the other when you might agree with a few things here, a few things there.
Right? No, that's
That can be
exactly right.
difficult for intellectual because they want to pigeonhole you. You're a left or you're a
Oh, that's
conservative, and you
exactly right.
for these conservative side. But then when your view diverges for them, like I identify more with the left on a lot of issues like foreign policy, but
Mhm,
then on some issue like the COVID, I
mhm.
identified more with the conservative libertarian. And
Right.
so I was like excommunicated, at least on those issues
Oh, I
from the
for sure.
and I think that's also by design that they want to divide people instead of us coming together to
Right.
challenge the class-based rule and the plutocracy. They
Absolutely.
want to compartmentalize. And I think that's a trick of the ruling elite, and that's why they infiltrate media. And I
Right.
think people don't realize how much left media is infiltrated, and their gatekeepers
For
who will
sure.
shut you down if you bring up certain topics in those left media. They shut you down, and
Oh,
that's because
right. Well, I mean, I think right now the plan, the billionaires, is to take the issues of immigration and abortion and use that to get basically all the working people fighting each other, so that
Mhm.
nobody can come
Yeah,
together
exactly. They play
against the
up those
rich.
issues when really the common ground is on the class issues and the
Right.
war and peace issues, dismantling, cutting the military budget significantly so money's invested domestically and not dismantling the welfare state and adopting more
Right.
social democratic
Right.
policies. A lot of the polls show that the majority of the public favors thing like free healthcare,
Right. Oh, for sure. For
regulation
sure.
of business. So people can, and that people don't, for instance, like majority don't want to keep arming Israel.
Right.
Majority want the Ukraine war resolved and don't want to spend billions of
Right.
dollars
No.
on
Well, I
weapons.
mean,
So we can easily come together, conservative, liberal, on those core issues. But yeah, they play up the immigration, the abortion to divide people. That's
right.
how they do it. Yeah.
It's well, listen, I really appreciate your taking the time today, Jeremy, to join me, and I hope we'll have a chance again to talk a little bit more about what we can expect from this second Trump administration, and the even more critical issue is of American society and where we came from and where we're going.
Absolutely. Great discussion.
Thank you again.
Thank you.